"I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson, but we have to let you go." The words rang in Arthur Dawson's ears like a death sentence. He sat frozen in the sleek, glass-walled office of Preston and Company, staring at Daniel Preston, the young CEO who barely looked a day over 30. The man spoke with a cold detachment, sliding a termination letter across the polished mahogany desk as if he were dismissing an intern rather than an employee who had served the company for over 40 years. Arthur, 63 years old, had dedicated his life to this company. He had been there before Preston was even born, back when his father, the late Richard Preston Sr., ran the business with integrity and respect. But times had changed, and now Arthur was nothing more than an obsolete asset in the eyes of corporate efficiency. "You can't be serious," Arthur finally spoke, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "I've given my whole life to this company. I trained half the people working here, and you're firing me because I'm too old." Daniel sighed, feigning sympathy as he leaned back in his leather chair. "Arthur, it's not personal. We're just restructuring. The company needs fresh ideas, younger minds. The board believes it's time to move forward." "Fresh ideas? Younger minds," Arthur repeated, his fists clenching. "I've brought in millions for this company. I've mentored employees who are now executives. And you're throwing me out like trash?" Preston checked his watch, growing impatient. "We appreciate your service, but let's be realistic. You're past your prime. It's time to make way for new talent." The words stung like a slap. Arthur felt his chest tighten as anger and humiliation warred within him. He had expected a dignified retirement, a send-off with gratitude, not this cold dismissal. "You have until the end of the day to clear out your office," Preston added, already moving on as he reached for his phone. "HR will handle the paperwork." Arthur stood up, his hands shaking. He looked around the office, the same one where he had once been celebrated as a top performer, and now he was being discarded like an old relic. As he walked out, he passed younger employees, most of whom avoided his gaze, whispering about his sudden termination. Only a few dared to give him sympathetic looks. Arthur took a deep breath. "If they think I'm just going to walk away quietly, they're dead wrong." Because Arthur Dawson had a secret, one that would turn the entire company upside down. Arthur stepped into his modest office, one that had been his second home for over 4 decades. The framed awards on the walls, the carefully arranged family photos on his desk, and the books filled with business strategies and negotiation tactics, all of it now seemed meaningless. His fingers trembled as he opened his desk drawer, pulling out a worn leather notebook. Inside were records, names, and dates, proof of everything he had done for this company. But none of that mattered to Daniel Preston. The young CEO only saw him as an outdated liability. Arthur sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. He could leave quietly. He could take the severance package, walk away, and fade into retirement. But that wasn't who he was. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark Lively, an old friend and CEO of a competing firm. "Still thinking about my offer? We could use a man like you, Arthur." Arthur stared at the message. Mark had been trying to recruit him for months, but Arthur had remained loyal to Preston and Company. He had believed in the company until today. He turned his gaze to the envelope on his desk. His severance letter, with a check that felt like an insult. What Daniel didn't know was that Arthur didn't need the money, because Arthur Dawson wasn't just a senior employee. He was a silent shareholder, one of the largest. Years ago, Preston's father had secretly given him shares as a reward for his dedication, knowing he had built much of the company's success. It was a gesture of gratitude, one that Daniel had clearly never bothered to learn about. Arthur smirked. Daniel thought he had fired an old man. But in reality, he had just fired one of the company's most powerful stakeholders, and he was about to find out the hard way. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. Daniel Preston thought he had gotten rid of an old man. But he had no idea that Arthur owned a significant stake in the company, one that could shake its foundation if he chose to use it. Instead of packing up, Arthur picked up his phone and made a call. "Mark, let's talk." 2 days later, Daniel Preston sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by his board members. He was in high spirits, bragging about the new direction the company was taking. "Now that we've streamlined operations," Daniel said confidently, "we can bring in younger, more innovative minds. This will—" The doors swung open. The entire boardroom turned as Arthur Dawson walked in. "What the—" Daniel scoffed. "You don't work here anymore, Arthur. Security should have—" "I don't need security to enter a company I partially own," Arthur cut in, his voice steady but firm. He stepped forward, pulling a folder from his briefcase and slapping it on the table. "Stock certificates, proof of ownership." Daniel's smirk disappeared. "No, that's not possible," Daniel muttered. He grabbed the papers, flipping through them. His father had given Arthur shares? Why had he never known? "You should have done your research before firing me, son," Arthur said, settling into a chair. "You fired one of the largest shareholders in the company. And now, I'm back." The boardroom was dead silent. Arthur clasped his hands together. "Let's discuss your leadership, Mr. Preston." Daniel's face drained of color as he skimmed through the documents. His hands trembled slightly, but he quickly masked his panic with a forced chuckle. "This is ridiculous," Daniel scoffed, tossing the papers onto the table. "So what if you have some shares? That doesn't mean you get to waltz in here and make demands." Arthur leaned forward, his expression calm but authoritative. "Actually, Daniel, it does." He glanced around the room, making eye contact with each board member. "As a major shareholder, I have the right to call for an emergency meeting to discuss company leadership. And given your reckless decisions, including firing experienced employees without cause, I think it's time we reconsider who's in charge." Murmurs spread through the boardroom. Some members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. Others, who had been secretly discontent with Daniel's leadership, nodded in agreement. Daniel gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening. "You're just an old man trying to hold on to the past. The company needs fresh leadership, not outdated methods." Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. "Fresh leadership? Or reckless leadership?" He tapped the folder of documents. "Did you even look at the quarterly reports? Under your leadership, profits have dropped by 18%. Client retention is at an all-time low. And let's not forget your latest marketing campaign, where you wasted millions on rebranding that drove customers away." The board members whispered among themselves, and a few even nodded in agreement. "That's enough," Daniel snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I'm the CEO, and my decisions are final." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Not for long." Silence fell over the room. "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence," Arthur announced, his voice firm. "Right here, right now." Daniel's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." But Arthur was dead serious. A heavy silence filled the boardroom as Arthur's words settled in. A vote of no confidence? Daniel had never imagined this scenario. "You don't have the authority to do this," Daniel barked, his voice laced with panic. Arthur smiled coolly. "Actually, I do. As a major shareholder, I have the right to bring this motion to the board. And from what I can see, I'm not the only one questioning your leadership." He glanced around the room. Some board members shifted uncomfortably under Daniel's glare, while others looked at Arthur with newfound respect. "Let's put it to a vote," Arthur said, leaning back in his chair. "Shall we?" Daniel's confidence cracked. His gaze darted around the room, looking for support. They wouldn't betray him, would they? The chairman of the board, an elderly man named Mr. Whitmore, cleared his throat. "I second the motion," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice steady. Daniel's face paled. "All those in favor of removing Daniel Preston as CEO, raise your hand," Arthur announced. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, hands began to rise. First Mr. Whitmore, then 2 more, then 5. Daniel watched in horror as more than half the board turned against him. "This is a joke," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "You're all making a mistake." But it was already over. The final hand went up, sealing his fate. "The majority has spoken," Mr. Whitmore said firmly. "Daniel Preston, you are officially removed as CEO." Daniel shot up from his chair, rage and disbelief twisting his face. "You can't do this. This is my company." Arthur stood slowly, his gaze steady. "No, Daniel. This was your father's company, and you just lost it." Daniel's shoulders slumped. He looked around the room, realizing no one would save him. Security appeared at the door. "Please collect your things, Mr. Preston," one of them said. Daniel clenched his fists, his breath ragged with fury. He turned back to Arthur, hatred burning in his eyes. "You think you've won?" Daniel spat. "You're just an old man clinging to the past. You'll run this company into the ground." Arthur remained calm. "Maybe," he said, "but at least I won't destroy it with arrogance." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Enjoy it while it lasts." And with that, he stormed out of the boardroom, leaving behind the empire he thought was his. The moment the door slammed shut, the room erupted into conversation. "Now that we have a leadership change," Arthur said, adjusting his sleeves, "it's time to fix the mess Daniel left behind." The board members nodded in agreement. Arthur Dawson was back. Arthur exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. The boardroom was still buzzing, but the weight of what had just happened was undeniable. Daniel was gone. The company, his father's legacy, was now in his hands. Mr. Whitmore turned to him, his expression filled with respect. "Arthur, welcome back. We need your leadership now more than ever." Arthur nodded. "We have a lot of work to do, and it starts with undoing Daniel's reckless decisions. The first order of business, rehiring the employees. Daniel fired." Arthur picked up the phone and called HR Director Linda Carter. "I want a list of every experienced employee Daniel terminated without just cause. Effective immediately, I want to offer them their jobs back, along with a personal apology." Linda, who had suffered under Daniel's rule, sighed in relief. "Absolutely, Mr. Dawson. I'll start the process right away." Arthur hung up and turned to the board. This company thrived because of the people who built it. Daniel treated employees like disposable assets, and that's why morale is at an all-time low. That ends today. Several board members nodded in approval. The second order of business, fixing the company's public image. Arthur gestured for his assistant. Get me the head of marketing. We need a strategy to rebuild customer trust. The rebranding disaster lost us millions. We need to restore our core values. Right away, sir, she said, hurrying out. Arthur pulled up a financial report. The numbers didn't lie. Daniel's reckless spending and short-sighted policies had nearly run the company into the ground. But Arthur wasn't here to watch his father's legacy crumble. He was here to save it. A press conference to announce the change. A few hours later, Arthur stood at the podium in front of a room filled with reporters. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone. I stand before you today to announce a new era for this company, he began. Effective immediately, I have reassumed leadership, and we will be making swift changes to correct the missteps of the past. The reporters fired off questions. What about Daniel Preston? Will he return? What changes are you making first? Arthur raised his hand to silence them. I won't comment on Daniel Preston's future, but I will say this. Our focus is on rebuilding trust. We are bringing back our loyal employees, reworking our strategies, and ensuring that our company remains true to the vision that made it great. A murmur of approval spread through the audience. Daniel had ruled with arrogance. Arthur would lead with wisdom. As he stepped down from the podium, his assistant handed him a folder. Sir, there's something you should see, she said hesitantly. Arthur opened it. His brows furrowed as he scanned the contents. It was a private email chain, one that revealed a shocking secret about Daniel's tenure as CEO. His problems weren't over yet. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he skimmed through the email chain. The messages were between Daniel and a private investor, and what they revealed sent a chill down his spine. Daniel had been secretly negotiating a buyout, one that would have sold off the company's assets piece by piece to an outside conglomerate. If the deal had gone through, thousands of employees would have lost their jobs, and the Dawson legacy would have been completely erased. Arthur clenched his jaw. So that was his endgame? He needed to act fast. Who else has seen this? Arthur asked his assistant. Only you and me, sir, she said hesitantly. But if Daniel was pushing this deal forward, the investors might already be in talks. If they get wind that he's been removed, they might try to pressure the board into approving it anyway. Arthur exhaled sharply. He had reclaimed his father's company just in time. But if he didn't stop this now, all of his efforts would be for nothing. A call to action, he turned to his assistant. Get me a meeting with the board, right now. Within an hour, the boardroom was full. The directors sat in tense silence as Arthur placed the email printouts in front of them. What is this? One of them asked. Evidence that Daniel Preston was about to sell us out, Arthur said. If this deal had gone through, this company would have been gutted, and thousands of employees would be out of work. He was willing to destroy everything my father built, for profit. A murmur of shock spread through the room. Some members exchanged guilty looks. Others clenched their fists, realizing how close they had come to disaster. One director, Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat. Arthur, what do you propose we do? Arthur's gaze hardened. We issue a formal statement, rejecting any sale discussions. Then we conduct a full internal audit. Every deal Daniel made, every contract he signed, we review them all. The board voted unanimously in favor of Arthur's plan. That evening, Arthur sat alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline. His phone buzzed. It was Daniel. Arthur let it ring for a moment before answering. You think you've won. Daniel's voice was cold. You don't understand how business works, Arthur. You can't save a sinking ship. I was doing what needed to be done. Arthur's grip tightened on the phone. You weren't saving the company. You were selling its soul. And now everyone knows it. A bitter laugh came through the line. You don't have what it takes to lead. You're too sentimental, too soft. Arthur's voice was calm but firm. No, Daniel. I just remember what this company was built for. People, not greed. And that's why I will succeed where you failed. A long silence followed. Then Daniel simply hung up. Arthur set the phone down, exhaling. It was over. The company was safe. The employees would have their jobs back. And Arthur had reclaimed his father's legacy. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Weeks later, Arthur stood in the main lobby, watching employees return with relieved smiles. The company was healing. Mr. Whitmore approached him. Your father would be proud, Arthur. You've done something remarkable. Arthur smiled. This is just the beginning. There's a lot more work to do. And as he turned to face his employees, he knew one thing for certain. The company was finally back in the right hands.